higher education broadly, as well as regarding technology-related projects in robotics, software, and hardware development, just to name a few. However, what is still needed is critical conversations about the social impacts of 4IR, regarding the types of citizens we hope to have, their ability to navigate 4IR, and participate in it as active agents of change. This will help to determine the type of school curriculum we need to develop future citizens, innovators, and thinkers of society and the world at large. I hope, Professor Kennedy, that this is the start of an enriching conversation around 4IR, the good and the bad. Over to you, Prof. Kennedy.
Thank you for the introduction, and I didn't realise there were 13 titles. Perhaps that's how we live and survive in the fourth industrial revolution. But I did want to take up on one point, because it may seem a little too much for someone to come to this university and talk about the fourth industrial revolution. This university is well known for its first mover work in the area. And for someone to come from outside and say, well, now I'm going to take hold of that and talk about it, may seem a little presumptuous. And it is presumptuous. Because to do it in this university is actually a great privilege because of the extraordinary work that's being done. And I hope that I may be able to initiate a conversation that will be a little bit different from the one that we usually have around the fourth industrial revolution, and to make sure that the foundations on which we're building are really solid foundations, not just for the economy, but for society as a whole. So what I'm going to try and do is relatively simple and straightforward, I hope. Because this university is well known for its work in the fourth industrial revolution, I'm not entirely sure what the collective understanding is. So I may tonight say things that you think are very pedestrian, everyone knows that, or I may say things that are not known at all. But the challenges of this new industrial revolution are certainly well known, and they're challenges, and I want to say, they're not so much the challenges of technology, they're challenges around the integration of the technology into life. So I am not a technologist, so I won't say a lot about the technology. I'll say a little, but I'm really more interested in the integration aspect and what that means for those of us who are taking part now, but more importantly what it means for young people in the future, and how we're going to construct the kind of future that young people will need to navigate this so-called revolution. I want to look at two areas. I'm not going to do this until towards the end of the presentation, around citizenship and around the school curriculum. So I'm going to build up to those and try and make a case for an approach which is not the approach that's being used right now, either here in this country or indeed in Hong Kong, where I come from, or in Australia, where I have some origins. So I'm going to say, what are we talking about? What is it? And if you want to add to that, please do so. And then I want to look at its implications and what it means for us as a society rather than as an economy. I want to look at the skills for the fourth industrial revolution. I think we've got to say that it's too late to think about the 21st century. It's almost gone. For me, it certainly is almost gone. And we've got to have a broader vista, I think. And then we're going to look at schools in particular and the school curriculum and try and suggest a way to think about that, and to look at citizens as well. The curriculum and citizenship go together, of course, but I've separated them for the purposes of what we're going to be doing tonight. Well, for those of you well-versed in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, these books will be of so well known to you that you don't want to know much more about them. But the point I want to make with the first one is that it comes out of the World Economic Forum. It is about the economics of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and there's extraordinary discussion and talk around that. I'm not going to talk much about economics. I'm not an economist. That shouldn't stop me, I don't think. I think perhaps non-economists should say a little bit more about economics. But it's not my approach tonight. But that's where it all started. It is based around the changes that are going to take place to the economy and what that means for those people who are going to be affected by them. The second book, I think, in my view, is more important. It's not so much about here it is, it's about, well, what do we do with it now that it's here? And many of Klaus Schwab's ideas, I think, are very interesting and take us way beyond the economy and way beyond the technology, if you like. And this is what most has influenced me, I think. It's his view, stated in that second book, that the Fourth Industrial Revolution will affect the very essence of our human experience. And so what I want to try and focus on tonight is exactly what that means. What kind of human experience are we talking about? And what might be the effects and what might be our responses to them. So I'd certainly recommend those books if you haven't had a look at them, but they don't go far enough in my view. So what is it that we're talking about? This little graphic, I think, is a very common graphic, and it's also a very misleading graphic. If you're an historian, and I notice Linda Chisholm is here, she will tell you these things don't happen one by one in confined periods of time. They happen over time, and they happen in integrated ways. There is a debate in the literature about whether the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution is really different from the Third Industrial Revolution. And that's an interesting debate, but in the end, not very productive, in the sense that it sometimes misunderstands what the debate is. So, if we think about the Third Industrial Revolution, as it was so called, it's about the iPhone that you're all clasping, the watch that you're all wearing, the computers that you still may have, the iPads that you have. It's about digital technology. It's about the way in which our lives have been ruled by this technology. But for the most part, this technology is separate from us, right? You have a watch, but it's separate. It's not part of you, and it doesn't substitute for you. You can use it, although the way in which it gets data and the way in which it understands data and the things that it tells you start to impinge on what the Fourth Industrial Revolution is about. And that is, it is about the integration of human and physical systems, not just that there's standalone technologies out there that we may or may not use and we may or may not pick them up. They're about the way in which the technology starts to be part of who you are. So when my watch says to me, Kerry, your exercise level is really not very good today, how does it know that? Well, that's, I think, when we start to get closer to the Fourth Industrial Revolution. When there's so much data around, there's so much artificial intelligence that your watch can tell you that you are not doing a good job today. You should be doing something else. But I want to explore this a little more because I think until we understand that we are really talking about not just technology, but about the way in which technology is developing and the way in which we are responding to it. So there's an excellent article here by Zhu, David and Kim who talk about the speed of the changes that are taking place, that it's almost impossible to keep up with. Interestingly, they talk about power and wealth, so that it's not just technology in a form that doesn't have some effects on who we are and the way we live. It will affect wealth and it will affect knowledge and who we are. So their recommendation is we should know about these changes, and I'm going to come back to that when I talk about the curriculum more generally, and we should be aware that the benefits are not equally shared. And if we've learnt one thing from globalisation, just one thing, it is that the benefits are not equally shared, that inequalities are a fundamental result of some of the things that we praise economically. And that's the same with technology as well. So I think this is very good advice that has all the components in it. Yes, there are changes. Yes, they're rapid. And they cause some disequilibrium in society. We are not the same people as we were. And this is what it kind of looks like, whether it's virtual reality, whether it's robotics, whether it's artificial intelligence, the driverless car, more virtual reality. We're not looking at something that's going to happen tomorrow. We're looking at what's happening today. And in that sense, the future's here. So even to be talking about the fourth industrial revolution at this point in time, when it's been going on now for several years, it will continue to go on, and we are part of it, whether we know we are or not, and whether we've experienced some of these things that we see here, or whether we are aware of changes in manufacturing industry, where if you look at this, you don't see any people, no people. You can play chess just by yourself with a robot. You don't need people. You don't need anybody else. You can be served in your favourite restaurant, not by your favourite waiter, but by your favourite social robot who can take your order, bring you the meal, and go away. And what's more, they don't need to be tipped. So they're saving us money. Just a side note on this, that the European Union at the moment is drawing up a charter of rights for robots, because robots are being treated, just as I said, no tips, they're not human, you don't need to do anything that will help them, they don't need it. But only the human rights advocates in the European Union could develop the concept that in fact robots have human rights, but they're not human, so they have rights. They have robot rights. So if you think that the rights agenda is really a big one now, it'll become even bigger as we proceed. And these are the kinds of things that people talk about when they characterise the fourth industrial revolution. In that top graphic, the whole idea of machine learning, of programming computers that don't need to be programmed anymore, because you program them to learn. And they learn from big data. Facebook is an excellent example of learning from big data. The whole kerfuffle that we learned about around Cambridge Analytics during the American election was all about machine learning, how machines become cleverer the more data that they get, how deep learning can tell you what the outcome should be if you have the right input. So if you take all the data from Facebook and work out the characteristics of people, you can predict the outcome of the election or an election. So machine learning, deep learning, you don't need people anymore even to program computers, which raises another interesting question about why we are so keen on including coding in the school curriculum. Social media, of course, we learn more and more that while social media looked as though it was a great thing to link us all together with our family and our friends, that in fact the data that's there can be used in multiple ways and used in ways that we don't know about, and can be used for political purposes, can be used for social purposes, simply because it's there. And people like Mark Zuckerberg, when they answer questions around this, look surprised. Well, I didn't really know this was going to happen. Well, if he's so bright, he should have learned that it was going to happen. Drone technology, of course, brings airports to a standstill in the UK, but will also deliver your favourite pizza. Again, you don't have to tip the pizza person. You just get the pizza from the drone that comes to your front door. Driverless cars. I've never seen many driverless cars, but I'm told that they're around and about, and that there are a few of them in Hong Kong. From my point of view, that's much better. I prefer a driverless car to a car that I drive. But there they are, and if you don't need driverless cars, if you don't need a driver, you don't need taxis, do you? Imagine that in the South African context. You don't need taxis because it's all driverless. The common thing about all of this is that people are less and less needed, people are less and less important, that life can go on without people. Let's see exactly how that can happen. What can robots do? Amazing things. They can do the harvest. They can build cars. They can move warehouse inventory. Have you ever seen a robot in a surgery, a medical surgery? Robots, it seems, are much more efficient than surgeons once they're set up. You can bring a social robot into your home who can do all the work for you, vacuum the house, look after the house. You don't need domestic helpers anymore. This is a big threat in Hong Kong, where there are some 600,000 domestic helpers who make their living in that area. 3D printing technology. Do you know there's only one part of the world I've seen 3D printing technology? That's in the United Arab Emirates, in a girls' school in Abu Dhabi, where young women were learning how to work with the 3D printer. They had a 3D printer laboratory. We didn't have 3D printer laboratories in Hong Kong, but some students in some parts of the world do, and they enter competitions and they do very well. You can print shoes, you can print cars, you can print houses, you can do amazing things with 3D printing, and you don't need people to do that very much. You don't need as many. Machine learning I've talked about. I think the potential here is really quite extraordinary as machines become more intelligent, and that's the whole function of artificial intelligence, is to make machines more intelligent. And I think originally, your Vice-Chancellor's not here, he's an expert in this, so I can say something. Originally the purpose of artificial intelligence was to try to model human intelligence, try to make computers as clever as humans. That's long gone. Computers are much cleverer. And so the task now is really to make computers so intelligent that they don't need to be programmed. They don't need to be looked after. They don't need new algorithms. They just need data. And the concept of big data is a very powerful concept. The more of it is around, the more of it that fuels the computer, and the more the computer is able to do things. And that's the same with quantum systems, with computers as well, that the speed and the way in which new things can be done, new things can be invented, simply through the machine rather than through people. Often you get a portrayal of the Fourth Industrial Revolution like this, and you see most of this is economic. Most of it is around, well, if we get robots to do all this work, we save so much money. But wait a minute, if we save so much money, we also lose lots of jobs. But in the end, I think this kind of diagram isn't very helpful, because it simply suggests that, well, we're in a new economic era. We're in a new economic zone, if you like. And you will recall discussions around globalization were very similar to the discussions around the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We can be more efficient, we can make more money, we can do things better than we're doing now, simply by trading in the free market area. Here, we can do things better because of technology. And we come back to Schwab, because I think what he is talking about here is very important. All of what I just said is true, but how does it affect who we are as people? How does it affect our identity as individuals? If, for example, you're a domestic helper and you don't need domestic helpers anymore. If, for example, you're a crop harvester and you don't need crop harvesters anymore. And dare I say it, even if you're a surgeon and we don't need surgeons anymore, that's at the very top end of the professional ladder. What does it do to who we are as people, who we are as individuals? This is the focus, I think, when we say that it's not just about economics. And I want to offer this definition. I think it's one that comes out of all that I've said before. the focus is on integration of human and technological capacity to produce economic, social and political solutions. And if that's how we view the fourth industrial revolution, we start to look at it in a slightly different way, because we see that after how many thousands of years of looking at people as being the centre of our universe, we now start to say, well, they're not so central anymore. We can get other things to do what people do. We can have solutions, whether they're political solutions around the use of big data, or whether they're economic solutions around who we can get to do the kind of work that is needed, has impact and flow-ons that perhaps we haven't thought of before. And sometimes you'll see headlines like this: humans today, machine tomorrow. This comes from a newspaper in Singapore, and the article, I'm not going to go to the article talks about simply, even in a small city-state like Singapore, with maybe 4 million people in the whole of that city-state, that more and more what's happening is that machines are taking over many of the functions that we're seeing. So let me look at the implications. On the one hand, we have the increasing use of robots and robots perform what you tell them to do. They don't do anything else, so it needs to be rules-based. But if you're in Hong Kong and you're going on a fast train to China, who will tell you how to get there? A robot wanders around the railway station, and you can talk to the robot and say, how do I get to this place and that place? The rules are there, very clearly specified, so it works. But of course, and this is a major discussion around the fourth industrial revolution, it causes disruption to the labour market. And that does have implications for what we do in schools and how we prepare young people. Increased productivity. That's why the World Economic Forum was so important, because it was all about productivity. But the opportunities are not equally shared. And I come back again to the lessons that we've had from globalisation. When you don't share outcomes equally, you get the kind of disruptions that I know here in South Africa you have felt, but you feel them internationally. If you create unequal societies, you get unequal outcomes and you get disruptive societies. Greater commercial convenience. People shopping online in China is just amazing. You know, no one carries money in China anymore. You just carry your phone and your WeChat card or your Alibaba paid card. You cannot catch a taxi in China with money. You must have a phone that has a WeChat or Alibaba on it. But extraordinary consumerism amongst people who can sit at home at night and say, oh, I'll just do a bit of shopping. People like Jack Ma love it, of course. So what I'm trying to say is that for each thing that looks like it's an advance, the kinds of ethical issues that are raised by gene editing and gene splicing. You may have heard recently that a Chinese scientist, not far from Hong Kong in Shenzhen, undertook a gene splicing experiment. He wanted to help a young couple to determine, not just determine the sex of their child, but to make sure that that child didn't have a disability. And he actively engaged in gene splicing, and it was successful. But the ethical issues around doing that have not been resolved. And strangely enough, it's unusual for people to do things in China when they don't tell anyone else about them, and he got into lots of trouble. 3D printing is, of course, amazing, and it can create artificial body parts, houses, etc. It can also create autonomous weapons that people can print their guns and go out and shoot people. So I think when we look at what are the advances on the one side, we see that there are balances on the other side, and perhaps not enough attention is being paid to some of the what might be called the downsides that are there. But education is about the future. And I think the one thing that we shouldn't do is believe that all of this is going to happen no matter what we do. I think that's the fundamental lesson that we have from whatever revolution it happens to be, is that education is a way, if you like, to harness the effects of the fourth industrial revolution, to bring it to heel, if you like. We are not ineffective agents destined to have our jobs taken away from us at any time. We can do what we need to do. And we can create the future that we want to create. That's what education does, and that's why education is so important, is that it's about doing something, not about just responding to something. But when I say that, I'm very aware of the context in which we now talk about the fourth industrial revolution. And it's like, I don't know how you decide between what's worse, globalisation or right-wing nationalism. I mean, what a choice to have. And the biggest problem I had in drawing this graphic was where to put democracy, because it doesn't really belong under globalisation, I don't think, but many states that support globalisation are also democratic, but I think it's problematic. Right-wing nationalism in Europe, well, not only in Europe, in the United States of America, in countries like Poland and Hungary, in the political parties that exist in almost every single European country, Brexit, for example, are all about marginalising the other, marginalising other people, which is not very much different from the inequality that exists as a result of globalisation. And I think you can put inequality as much under right-wing nationalism as you can under globalisation. But the context, I think, therefore, is very dynamic. The title of my new book was mentioned. I don't want to promote it, of course, but it is about a volatile environment that is very difficult to predict, where values are being turned upside down, where countries that we thought were democratic are using democratic processes like elections to institute agendas that are totally undemocratic. And into all of this come educators saying, what are we going to do about the fourth industrial revolution? Well, what are we going to do about right-wing nationalism? What are we going to do about globalisation? So it's not as simple, now we're dealing with the fourth industrial revolution. We can forget about globalisation, we can forget about right-wing nationalism. We can try and just do one thing at a time. We've got to somehow do all of these things at once, rather than focus on one together. But I'd recommend in this book, The Global Education Policy Environment in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I think the problem with books like this is that they get written and 2 years later the global environment is so different that they don't apply anymore. So, but we need to be aware that when we're setting about on an agenda, that the political and social environments are just very, very complex. And I'm not sure that the fourth industrial revolution has a position on either side of these. It will take place in all kinds of societies. So what are the challenges? I think in general, when you look at the literature, it's very clear. It is how to manage the growing power of technology and how to be wise in relation to the growing power of technology. And Max Tegmark says here, we don't want to learn from our mistakes. I mean, that's a good way of saying, well, retrospectively, we should have done this. The issue here is, no, we need to do something straight away, not make a mistake and then learn from it. It's good to learn from mistakes, but it's actually better not to make mistakes in the first place. Again, Tegmark, what do we want the role of humans to be? If machines can do everything better and cheaper than us, then what is our role as human beings? What is our role as people in this world? The last time this question was asked seriously would take us back to the Enlightenment period, and where people started to question, why do we have to continually obey the commands of religious authorities? Why can't we make decisions on our own? Now, we're talking then about the 17th and 18th century, and up until now, that paradigm has been pretty much accepted. We can make decisions on our own, but now the question is different. Other non-humans are making decisions instead of us. So the whole humanistic basis of education starts to be questioned, because it doesn't only involve humans, it involves others as well. Let me change tack a little bit and talk about 21st century skills, because often 21st century skills are offered as the panacea. What we need to do is to change the curriculum and talk about 21st century skills. Well, these are the 21st century skills that were suggested in 2015. And we can go a bit earlier, and towards the end of the 20th century there were sets of 21st century skills. And people kept saying, well, this is what needs to guide the curriculum. But out of the World Economic Forum came a new set of skills. These are the 2020 skills. So they keep changing all the time. So my view is we should start talking about the skills we need for the 22nd century, not the 21st century, because these keep changing all the time. And there are some significant differences between the two. These are the most significant differences. Creativity now comes out on absolute top, and if you compare it with 2015, it is much more significant now than before. Creativity, I think, is two-dimensional. One is there's creativity in the creation of the technologies, in the use of artificial intelligence. That's creativity. But a greater creativity, it seems to me, is how you work out the benefits that will be derived from those technologies. Who will they help? Who will they not help? And what do we really want as we advance the technology? So creativity is double-edged, I think. It is about creating new things and better things, but maybe it involves also thinking about how we use them. And so the question arises is, can robots be as creative as humans? What's the answer to that question? This is the fundamental question for the fourth industrial revolution. Do we want them to be? Negotiation and flexibility aren't quite so important anymore, because robots can't negotiate, and they're not flexible in any way whatsoever. So the kind of skills that are needed are a little bit different from the ones that we're using before. And they have to be constantly kept under review. Now, here are a few other kinds of skill lists. You can find these skills lists in different places. Adaptability and agility. Why is agility so important? Because robots aren't agile. Agility is one of the great human characteristics. So being agile is something we may have to think about cultivating a little bit more. Critical thinking and problem solving, of course. This enters almost every single list. Assessing and analysing information. Yes, but computers do it better. This is a big issue. Analysing and assessing information is no longer just a human characteristic. It's what computers do, and they do it better than we do. Collaboration across networks. I do think collaboration is fundamental, but it's collaboration with other people and with other non-humans as well. How do you collaborate with the robot? How do you make sure with the artificial intelligence that it's working, you're working together and not working against each other? And this unusual public speaking skills is put on this list because it's thought that there will be a much greater need to explain things and to take part in public explanations of what's happening. It's not a private affair. Graham Brown Martin has some very interesting things to say, but they mix with everything else. Creative endeavours. And the very interesting thing is, and I think we should take this aboard, is that we need to see science as a creative endeavour. And we should stop dividing scientific and humanities. They're equally creative. Social interaction is very important. Robots cannot take part in that. And so the way in which we interact together becomes much more important. And again, he also mentions the physical dexterity and mobility, because we are better at that than robots. But what about the challenge for education in all of this? And I'd like you just to listen to this for a minute. This is Jack Ma, the Chinese entrepreneur who owns Alibaba, which is the largest online shopping company in the world. But he has recently taken up the cause of education, and he has some interesting things to say.
Education is a big challenge now. If we do not change the way we teach, 30 years later we'll be in trouble. Because the way we teach, the thing we teach our kids are the things the past 200 years is knowledge-based. And we cannot teach our kids to compete with a machine who is smarter. We have to teach something unique that this machine cannot catch up with us. Value, believing, independent thinking, teamwork, care for others. These are the soft part. The knowledge may not teach you that. So that's why I think we should teach our kids sports, entertainment, the music, painting, art. So making sure humans should be different from everything we teach should be different from the machine. If the machine can do better, you have to think about it.
Now that from perhaps one of the world's leading entrepreneurs. And I thought when I listened to that, well, what if I try to convince my local Ministry of Education to change the curriculum to be what Jack Ma says it should be? I wouldn't give myself very much chance to do that. Now, I don't entirely agree with everything that he says, but I think what he says is radical enough to help us to stop and think about what we should be doing, what we should be teaching in light of what we know about the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So I want to introduce a framework. I can't talk about this whole framework, but I'm going to talk about a little bit of it. But I think the framework might be useful. I think when we come to learning, there are three basic things that we need to keep in mind. And the first is, there is little doubt that we should work out how to learn with the technology of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We don't say, no, that's not for us, we know how to teach. Jack Ma says we don't know how to teach, or we don't know what to teach. But here, I think, there's no doubt that, for example, there's abundant evidence now that the use of social robots with autistic children help those children to make great social strides because they can interact with a robot in a way that they can't interact with people. So robots in classrooms? Yes. As tutors to take the role of teachers? Never. But there will be specific functions for them to perform. Virtual reality, there's just appeared in the literature a very exhaustive review of the way in which virtual reality can be used in educational contexts. That is teaching with a product of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. The use of big data, for example, in assessment. There needs to be a move away from these large-scale international assessments towards more personalised assessment. And you can now do this by constructing huge numbers of assessment items that can be used across education systems in a reliable way. And those items can get better because the computer will know how to make them better. So there are multiple ways that we can teach. We can help students to learn, and that's important. The second area I've called learning to live in the fourth industrial revolution, and I ain't going to talk about this. Another term might be what is the curriculum, but it sounds not good enough to me because we're in the fourth industrial revolution. So how are we going to learn in it? And what are we going to learn? Two things. And finally, the fourth industrial revolution asks us to learn with wisdom. So I've used the Chinese character for wisdom, I hope. Because that perhaps is the underpinning of learning. We can learn in many different ways and we can learn many different things, but the issue is to be wise about that. And perhaps wisdom seems like an old-fashioned virtue, and it is. But in these challenging times, then learning with wisdom is very, very important. For example, I mentioned the concept of robots as tutors and the replacement of teachers. When we reflect on that, it's not a wise thing to do. There are things that teachers do that robots cannot do. There are things that robots do that are very good, but there are things that teachers do that cannot. So we have to think about that and reflect on it and say, well, why is it that we should do one and not the other? Why should we have a robot looking after autistic children and not everyone else in the classroom? Lots of debate and lots of discussions will take place. I think you could have a whole session on learning with fourth industrial revolution technology. I will leave that to the technologists to do. I think it's an exciting area to be in and to think about. And I'd like to focus now on learning to live in the fourth industrial revolution. If we take Jack Ma and summarise him, it's basically that. This is what education's about. Values, believing, independent thinking, teamwork, care for others. Teachers must stop teaching knowledge. Well, I'm sure in this room tonight we're going to have a big debate about that. I just want to say, I think it's, as I said before, I think it's useful for him to have said that because it will help us to think, but I don't think it's the answer. So, what's the answer? Do I know more than Jack Ma? Well, he has more money than I do, so maybe not. When people thought about the curriculum maybe towards the end of the 19th century, this was basically it. It was a curriculum around Greek and Latin. Everyone did Greek and Latin. Every boy, that is, who went to grammar schools did Greek and Latin. And eventually when girls went to grammar schools, they did Greek and Latin as well. Always language, always history, geography, always mathematics and physics and chemistry, and we know these subjects, right? And we see them, we can probably go to most schools today and see most of them probably not Greek and Latin, but I wouldn't be too sure actually. In some schools we might still find Greek and Latin, but Greek and Latin has disappeared. Perhaps the great achievement of education in the 20th century was to take Greek and Latin out of the school curriculum, but the rest of them still there. Well, if you went to a grammar school, that is. If you didn't go to a grammar school, reading, writing and arithmetic was good enough. If you were a working class kid, just to learn to read and write and add up was okay. So the academic curriculum was a curriculum and is a curriculum for a particular group of students. And one of the things we need to avoid is this bifurcation of the curriculum, where some people need Greek and Latin and language, etc. Others just need to learn reading, writing and arithmetic. We need to avoid that because much of the discourse around the fourth industrial revolution says, well, yes, there'll be high-end jobs, but there'll equally be low-end jobs. And this idea that you only need high-end workers is wrong. Now, as I said, I'm not an economist, but I think the literature is clear. The jobs that will disappear are largely middle-level jobs. I think the economists use the term hollowing out. What that means is that you will still need to have people who will perform the low-end jobs. And the danger is that the curriculum for them will be summarised as reading, writing and arithmetic. And I think the point that we need to make is, no, that's not the way to do it. We do not need a bifurcated curriculum to cater for the different economic needs of the country. Well, there are some different ways to look at the academic curriculum, which I've called here the subject-based curriculum, and probably some of you here know these very well. The acronym STEAM is constantly used now: science, technology, engineering, art and math. You can tell that's an American graphic because it uses the term math, which I don't usually use. Put more of them together and you get what over time has been called the integrated curriculum. I think there's great merit in the integrated curriculum, but I don't think it's the answer. For the most part, the integrated curriculum does not move us away from the academic curriculum or the knowledge-based curriculum. It simply reorganises it. So STEM, which I think is probably more popular even than STEAM, is characterised as what the Fourth Industrial Revolution needs, but often it's still taught in quite disparate or separate areas. You don't get an integration of knowledge in the teaching of STEM. So it's still built around this idea that you need the subjects, you need the academic curriculum. I know there's always a debate about the academic curriculum and what's important, etc., etc. But I think we need to go further than this. This is one way to go further. Let's make it that we put problem solving and critical thinking and innovation at the centre of the curriculum. That's a good idea. Well, it's certainly not a bad idea. And you have Einstein's quote that education is not the learning of facts but training the mind to think. Well, that sounds okay. But that's why we taught Latin, right? We taught Latin. Well, we didn't teach Latin. In the 19th century, the reason for teaching Latin was it was a good mental discipline. It trained the mind to think. So yes, one way is to change the curriculum around so that it is less subject-based and more skills-based. But teaching people to think isn't the only thing that we need to do. And I just got this off the internet. It's a conversation. Yogo Taro is a big Japanese game maker, and he says, "Can a robot learn to be human?" And Yogo says, "Can a human learn to be human?" And David Cage has no idea what he's talking about, and so Yogo Taro repeats it, "Can a human learn to be human?" Cage says, "I don't get it." I think many people don't get it, but I think Yogo Taro's question is the fundamental question now. Can a human learn to be human? Now, to ask that question in this country, I think, gives you very interesting responses. What does it mean to be human? Now, here we could have a debate for the rest of the time that's available. What are those qualities which make humans human in a positive sense? And this suggests all kinds of ways that we are human, whether it's compassion that makes us human, or whether it's spirituality that makes us human. You'll notice that Jack Ma didn't talk about spirituality at all. Which is kind of interesting coming from someone in a Chinese environment. Freedom, is that the basic human characteristic? I think this deserves a lot of debate and a lot of discussion as we work our way through what are the curriculum implications. And of course the question arises, well, how do you teach people compassion? How do you teach people about freedom? How do you teach people? And I came across this, which I'm sure you all know, because to me this is quite fundamental. Of course, we can teach people about anything. And here, of course, Nelson Mandela is saying, we're not born with a certain predisposition, despite some theological arguments to the contrary. That predisposition is developed. So we can develop it, and we can make sure that teaching about being human is achievable, rather than something that is not. And so what I want to suggest in a kind of simple way is that if you take creativity, critical thinking and problem solving as the central skills of the century that are needed, and these are the ones that were defined out of the World Education Forum, and you add to that learning to be human, I think it takes on a different complexion. We're not just talking about analytics and analytical skills, we're talking about very human skills. If you are teaching with fourth industrial technology, this model is relevant. If you are teaching about the fourth industrial revolution, and that should be part of the curriculum, then this model is relevant. If you're teaching young people to be part of it, about the skills that they will need, then this is relevant. And therefore the question is, when you say, well, what should be in the school curriculum? Should coding be in the school curriculum? Computer coding has become the big issue, certainly where I come from, and big projects are being funded by philanthropic groups. Now the question is not so much coding, but what does coding do? What does it help? Does it help problem-solving skills? I suspect it does. Does it help critical thinking? I'm not sure about that. Does it help creativity? Probably it does. Well, on that basis, you might make a decision, yeah, it's important, but then it's got to be traded off against other things. Well, what else do we want in the curriculum, apart from coding? Frankly, I think coding would be better than much mathematics. But I'll leave that, I won't go there. We'll get different answers to that question. But I think what I want to suggest is that a model like this can drive the curriculum. Nothing should be there that isn't related to this. Now, I really hesitate to mention the term outcomes-based learning, because I know it has not a good reputation. But frankly, I think that's the question. What do you want young people to know, be able to do, and value? If you can't answer that question in a positive sense, don't put it in the curriculum. It doesn't deserve to be there. If it's not developing creativity, it doesn't deserve to be there. If it's developing rote learning, it doesn't deserve to be there. If history is about learning the dates, as it is in the teaching of Chinese history in Hong Kong, where if you ask any Hong Kong person the subject they hate most, it's Chinese history. And why do they hate it? Because they have to learn every dynasty. Do you know how many dynasties there are in China and how often they changed? It shouldn't be in the curriculum. It doesn't do anything. There are other reasons for Chinese history being in the curriculum. Citizenship education. You can tell I'm coming now to an end of this. I think you can use a very similar model and an important model, because citizenship education is not just a separate subject in the school curriculum. My view is that citizenship education is at the centre of the curriculum, whether you want it to be or not. Schools have a role in preparing future citizens, whether you do that explicitly or implicitly. Let me get myself into trouble. I think here you do it implicitly with life orientation education, rather than explicitly with civic education. It needs to be explicit, because we need citizens in the future who are creative. We need citizens who solve problems, not make them. And we need citizens who are critical thinkers and who can say about a newspaper article, yeah, that is fake news. Yes, I know where that comes from. And I know where it comes from because I know about artificial intelligence. I know how data is generated. and I can question it. And it should be values oriented. I think there are issues around global and local education. I'm not a great fan of global citizenship education, so I've probably alienated half of you already. But it is important to be globalised, but it's also equally important to be local. We are local citizens and global citizens at the same time. There's no difference. We're at the same time. Civic engagement is very important, and I know you place a lot of emphasis on civic engagement here. And it will continue to be important as the technologies of the Fourth Industrial Revolution advance, and you've got to have some kind of civic response to those. They're not the demand simply of civic engagement. Be tolerant and caring, I agree 100% with Jack Ma there. This must be an outcome of citizenship education, tolerant and caring society. And I would ask you, where else in the curriculum does this happen except in citizenship education? And I will throw in support for democracy, because my sense is internationally that there's declining support for democracy. The literature on this now is utterly amazing, and I'll share with you that the reason I wrote my new book is because I sense that the support for democracy is quelling not just in China and in Russia and in Poland and in Hungary, but in the United States, in the United Kingdom and in Australia, in those countries which traditionally have been called mature democracies. Can you imagine these days calling the United States a mature democracy? I don't think so. Or even the United Kingdom. What goes on there is not mature. So I'm thinking this is what ought to be happening. So the model is similar because I think the outcomes are similar. And this will happen whether we program it or not. And that's what we need to take into account. I finalise with this quote: a reboot of citizenship will also bring into sharp perspective those qualities which make us human and which can continue to distinguish us from artificial intelligence. That's the motive. That's the social outcome that we're looking for when we're looking for outcomes from the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So, thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer questions.
We were talking about, you, and we were very disappointed in, there's no sentence in your presentation said, actually indicate which robot will be able to write our articles and publish it.
I think it's not far away. But maybe it is that its reviewers have become robots. That's our problem these days.
Human agency will be diminished, and because our ability to learn new things through making choices, happens, and if AI technology will be making some of those choices, do you think that human agency is at stake?
I think it's entirely up to us. You can let human agency take a back seat, but I think, as you see, and you see the debates today, media debates around what's right, what's wrong, what's true, you can't sit back and let that happen. Thus the citizenship issue. You've got to, I think, equip young people to stand up and say, no, that's not what I want to happen, I want something else to happen. No, I'm not going to support this group because they're not doing what I want to do. And that's why the citizenship outcome issue is so important. That people don't see, there are so many big machines and they're all telling us different things and I don't know how to cope with this, etc., etc. So I think human agency remains important as long as we make it important and not give up that the world is going to be overtaken by non-human processes that include robots and artificial intelligence.
Kevin, I think for me it's about humanization. when we look at work we did in the past about free will and matters of choice and matters of thinking critically, currently we all just seem to be jumping onto this very, very for this bandwagon. Everybody's just moving with it. This is it, this is it. And no one stops to think and to reflect. So for me, looking back at humanization is very, very important.
I do think if I had to pick of all the values and skills, I would pick critical thinking as the most fundamental skill that you want to develop. Or I think it's both a skill and a value that you want to develop. Because only if we have citizens who are critical thinkers can they discern what's happening out there. But I think what we're saying now in the broader sphere, in the social sphere, is it's not just about the political sphere. That's one way to do it, but it's about everything. It's about the way in which, for example, in companies that might be looking only at the bottom line, that people need to say, well, there are other things apart from the bottom line that are important. And because they think that through, the fact that you can displace every single domestic helper in the world leads you to the question, well, why would you want to do that? There may be some tasks that robots can do that domestic helpers can't do, and they might be able to work together. So it's trying to think all that through. And if graduates don't have that critical thinking capacity, then you go back to Devika's question about are we just going to give up? And I think the answer should be no. That's what being human is about. It's actually about not giving up in any context.
You mentioned equality and inequality also. Now, South Africa, as we know, is a deeply unequal society, and inequality is deepening every day as we speak. I wonder if you could just help us think through a bit more about what the implications are for inequality and how in education and civics education or whatever one could possibly address that. I just want you to help us think through that a bit more.
Well, thank you for that very simple question, Linda. First of all, I think it's very important to recognise that education cannot solve every single problem in the world. And I think inequality is one of those issues. But we can make sure that education doesn't exacerbate the inequalities. And one of the things that we know about education is that very much depends on the school that kids go to. In Singapore, for example, the results of PISA can be used to explain the fact that 60% of the variance in the scores of students can be accounted for simply by the school that they went to. Not by their socioeconomic status, although there's a link, but because the school system is such a stratified system, and kids go to school 1, 2, 3 and 4, then the results fall out exactly like that. So the way in which an education system is organised is one step around not exacerbating inequalities. And the Singapore government is very clear that they're aware of the problem. They don't know how to solve it. They actually don't like you to tell them that it's a problem, but it is a problem. So the way the schooling system is structured is a problem. I think the way that schools are organised is a problem. If you stream students in classes, then of course the best students will do very well and the poorer students will not. Research tells us very clearly that mixed ability classes benefit everybody. And so the actual organisation of schooling is important. The way classes and the way schools are run and structured are important. The more work that's done on secondary data analysis of the large-scale assessments, which I know aren't always popular topics of conversation, the more it suggests that schools, apart from the individual students who come to them, that schools themselves are very powerful forces in determining what happens to students. For example, some recent work we've done on civic education shows us that in schools where the school principal, for our colleagues, in schools where the school principal takes an active role in ensuring there are activities around participation in the school, the kids do better. Where principals recognise that there needs to be open classroom climate and they support teachers to do that, kids do better. So there's lots of research which tells us what we can do so that we don't exacerbate inequality. Now that doesn't handle the big inequalities in society, it doesn't deal with the economic issues, but I think it's what schools are able to do to make sure that inequality cannot be attached to what it is that are the outcomes of schooling as far as students are concerned.
Sorry, I didn't mean generally, I sort of meant specifically in relation to the Fourth Industrial Revolution. How does the Fourth Industrial Revolution deepen inequalities, and specifically in education? I'm sorry, I wasn't specific.
I think in terms of labour market disruption, in terms of the disappearance of jobs, in terms of what jobs are available in the labour market for the graduates of schooling, I think they're the most immediate effects that it will have. And so therefore how students are prepared in schools to meet what will be a disruptive kind of labour market is very important. Now one set of responses will say, well, let's just make them all entrepreneurs and make them all entrepreneurial. Well, that could work for some of them. But it may be that the school's role is really very significant in making them entrepreneurial, but making them more critical as well, so they know the choices that are in front of them and they can make decisions about those choices. I think for the graduates of schooling, it is the labour market implications that most people would say are the most important, particularly when there will be so many low-level jobs, low-skilled jobs. The temptation will be to prepare students for those low-skilled jobs, rather than prepare all students for jobs that to which they can aspire. And I think that's very important, that we don't return to the reading, writing and arithmetic curriculum for working class kids.
Thank you. So I just wanted to ask, my name is Sergio, and we're leading the campus at the currently we are at the SRC of the university. So I'm also a faculty student. From what you're saying, in my understanding, maybe it's a bit narrowed. I just think that the whole fourth industrial revolution in terms of presentation is to simply say, let's divorce reasoning and let's exempt our leaders from decision making and have robots in our society to fill that vacuum. And of course, given the conditions of most, I'll speak specifically of black people, there's no room for them in this fourth industrial revolution. I feel like it's simply to say that let's have robots make decisions so that when the killings happens, humans are exempt from being accountable. So to me, this is simply a way of, having another form of oppression that, of course, will not have a face. That's my whole understanding of this concept for the Industrial Revolution.
There is a very strong link between the economics and the labour market and hypercapitalism. Now, it's a link that is not made explicitly, but it's certainly there. And I think that requires us to pay more attention and to have someone explicate what you're saying, because I think it's very important in the sense that the preparation of young people can't be preparation for low-skilled jobs or no jobs. There has to be another form of, at the school level at least, but I would argue at the university level as well, that prepares either young people in schools or graduates of universities to make sure that whatever the economic conditions are, that they can be grasped. But it is an agenda. It's an agenda that came out of the World Economic Forum, and it's an agenda that is a capitalist agenda. There's no doubt about that. And therefore, I think it is up to universities, if we look at universities, to make sure that graduates are able to not only cope with, but influence what's going to be happening. So I think your point is a very important point.
Hello, Kevin.
Oh,
so for
yes.
me, the issue really goes into the space of creativity. Because I think for a very, very long time, and particularly in this country, the idea of the creative arts, of science as a creative kind of space has long been downplayed by the mathematical and by all of the other things. And so it's interesting for me to see how that is now being played out as being one of the critical areas that we have to start growing and developing. And part of it also is attached to this concept of identity. I wondered, from a perspective of all of the kinds of things that we teach at school, traditional or non-traditional, how does the integration then of how teachers actually work within whatever their subject field is, infuse not only the values and all of the other things, because I think when you do science, there's an ethics that's involved with that, and there's a creativity that can also
Yes.
be connected to that. So how would you be able to work with mathematics as a beautiful thing and so forth? So those are the spaces that I think would be the kind of exposure that we need in teacher preparation, for example, as well as how we approach. Then secondary to that would be the conjecture that we don't teach children how they learn. We impose pedagogies which seem to be what has been there and has worked for the industrial revolution, but no longer works for where children are currently. So how would teachers adapt themselves to some of that? Because I think that that's where the role then becomes part and parcel of what you're talking about. What does it mean to be human? I wonder what your thoughts on that is.
Well, I think it brings us back to the issue of how might we creatively use the technologies that are around to develop the creativity that we want. And I do see that first part of the framework around teaching with Fourth Industrial Revolution technologies is about asking the question about creative teaching. How can we, if you like, change the pedagogies that will engage young people and that will better suit where they are, rather than the more didactic 19th century pedagogies that we tend to favour. I didn't say anything about teacher education, but I think the implications for teacher education are quite fundamental. The way that we prepare teachers to handle these issues. And in terms of creativity, I think you're right, the old debates that, well, there's do a bit of arts and you'll be okay. I think even at the university level, we should be saying, if you're a science, you may say this, I don't know, if you're a student in artificial intelligence, you should be studying some philosophy and some history. Mm-hmm. And if you're a history major, you should be looking at the very basis of artificial intelligence to understand it. There needs to be a look at the university curriculum to see how these things can be done, as well as at the school curriculum. In terms of creativity in the schools, I agree with you that science should be regarded as a creative endeavour and not a scientific endeavour. If those two things are opposite, I think they're not opposite, but we need to look at them in different ways. And we need to look at, for example, the kind of creativity that comes out of drama that we might marginalise even in the English curriculum as well. Drama is not so important, but drama is fundamentally important. You get a third-year drama student into an IT laboratory and see what happens. Drama students can be very creative, even in domains that they haven't studied before. So we do have to look at the subjects and see how they can work together, but how they can work separately as well. Otherwise, we stay where we are.
Probably, yeah.
Oh,
I'm
yes.
just curious. my day job is about relationships and human connection and how to build that. And in the UK, they've established a Ministry of Loneliness. How do we, because people are so isolated and how it impacts the economy and leads to mental health, well-being issues, how do we ensure within curriculum and within education that we continue to, even in the spaces where children learn and engage with artificial intelligence, continue to hone the skills of human and social interaction as well?
Yes. I think for a whole variety of reasons, we see one of the problems of technology is that our main interactions during the day and part of the night is with the technology. This is as true for children and young people in schools as it is for adults. So there does need to be a sensitization. I don't want to go so far as to say, well, put your phones away, we're not going to do that, don't do this, because it won't work very well. But I think we do need to stress that social interaction is so important. And that's why you could never support robotic tutors in classrooms as a substitute for teachers, because it's a social interaction that the teacher has with the students that's so important. I guess to go where you want to go, we've got to take that kind of education much further about how can social interaction, I think that was listed as one of the skills, how can social interaction become the basis of many of the things that we do, because that's what makes us human. Robots can't do it, we can do it. The question is how, and if people like you do that every day, maybe you should teach some people here how to do it with young teachers. It's a very good question, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of everybody in this room, that's faculty, lecturers, and our dear students, I want to thank Prof. Kennedy for this very enlightening talk and kind of trying to displace the dominant discourses in 4IR, which seem to be mostly about economic matters and about technology. So in dealing with this issue about 4IR, the question I ask is, what would robots not be able to do that humans can do? And I think Prof. Kennedy has said that one is agility, the other is public speaking. But from the industry world, in Japan they hired robots to take over hotel responsibilities. But they had to fire all of them because for one, the robot could not discern between snoring and a request for something from patrons. So with that, I'd like to thank Prof. Kennedy and say, yes, it's been good.
And my watch just told me I've been standing still for too long, so it's time.
Okay, and just on the last note, there are some snacks available next door, so please come and join.